The morning air carried the smell of espresso and ambition in equal measure. Hartwell and Sons Coffee House sat at the corner of 5th and Madison, wedged between a private wealth management firm and a boutique law office. And it wore that geography like a badge of honor. The interior was all polished mahogany and brushed brass fixtures, the kind of place where a single cup of coffee cost more than most people's lunches, and where the background noise was a steady murmur of merger discussions and quarterly projections. By 9 o'clock on a Tuesday, every velvet chair was occupied by someone who looked as though they had somewhere important to be. Suits pressed, phones face up on the table, voices pitched just low enough to signal that whatever they were discussing was far too significant for ordinary ears. The baristas moved with practiced efficiency behind the counter, memorizing names without being asked, delivering oat milk lattes to regulars before they even reached the register. It was, by every outward measure, a place where success came to be seen. He walked in at 9:17, and nobody looked up. That was the first thing. Not a single head turned, not a single conversation paused, because there was nothing about the man that demanded attention. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, with the kind of face that had spent a great deal of time outdoors without ever being particularly concerned about it, weathered but not haggard, calm in a way that read simply as tired to anyone who didn't look long enough. His jacket was a faded olive canvas field coat, the sort that outdoor supply stores discontinued a decade ago, worn at the elbows and missing one of its lower buttons. He carried a black nylon backpack with a frayed shoulder strap, slung over his left shoulder with the easy, habitual positioning of a man who always needed both hands free. His name was Marcus Hale, though no one in that coffee shop knew it yet, and most of them would not have cared if they did. He approached the counter and ordered without consulting the menu board, as though he had decided before he arrived. "Just a regular drip coffee, please, whatever the smallest size is." The barista, a young woman with kind eyes named Priya, smiled and told him it was $3.50. He paid in cash, exact change pulled from a jacket pocket, and moved to a small corner table near the far wall, a table that gave him a clear sightline to the entrance, both side windows, and the back hallway where the restrooms and emergency exit were located. He sat with his back to the wall and his face toward the room, and he set the backpack on the floor between his feet rather than hanging it on the chair hook. He wrapped both hands around the paper cup and let the warmth settle into his palms. At the center table, a group of 4 had been deep in conversation for the better part of an hour, a merger deal of some kind. From what fragments carried across the room, 3 men in their 40s and 50s, and 1 woman who did most of the talking. Her name was Vivienne Carr, and she was 36 years old, director of marketing at a mid-sized investment consulting firm, and she carried herself with the particular confidence of someone who had clawed her way to a position of authority and mistaken the climb for proof of superiority. She was attractive in a high-maintenance way, immaculate blowout, a white blazer that cost more than Marcus's entire wardrobe, rings on 4 fingers, and a watch that could have paid off a car. She spoke quickly and laughed loudly, and had the social habit of making everyone around her feel subtly assessed and found wanting. The men at her table laughed at the right moments, leaned in when she leaned in, and generally behaved like people who had learned that agreeing with Vivienne Carr was the easiest path through any given morning. Marcus was not watching her. He was watching the room, the door, the windows, the rhythm of who came and went with an attention so quiet and so complete that it registered to an outside observer simply as a man staring into the middle distance. He catalogued things the way he always did in public spaces. The barista who moved with her left hand slightly favoring, which meant she was right-handed, and the espresso machine was positioned wrong for her. The man by the window whose knee bounced in a steady rhythm that had nothing to do with caffeine. The way the front door, when it opened, let in a 4-second draft that briefly disrupted the ambient temperature of the room. None of this was deliberate anymore. It was simply what his mind did with its peripheral capacity, the way a musician hears intervals in ordinary noise. His phone buzzed once. He answered it without changing his expression, his voice low and even. "Hey, buddy. No, I'm out right now. I'll be back before your practice." A pause, longer than the first. "I know. I won't miss it." I've never missed one, have I? Another pause, and then something shifted almost imperceptibly in his face, the lines around his eyes, softened by a fraction of a degree, and the corner of his mouth moved in something that might have been the beginning of a smile if someone had been looking closely enough. Yeah, I love you too. Go eat your breakfast. The egg's on the stove, not the cereal. The cereal is for emergencies. He set the phone face down on the table and took a slow sip of his coffee and sat with whatever that conversation had given him for a moment before he returned his attention to the door. It was Vivienne who heard it. Not all of it, just enough. She had glanced up from her papers at the sound of his voice, the way one glances up at a noise that doesn't quite belong to the ambient texture of the room. And she had caught the tail end of it. Single dad, she thought. She had heard it clearly. She turned back to her colleagues with a small, curling smile and said nothing for exactly 10 seconds, and then she said it at a volume that was just a hair above conversational, not loud enough to be called shouting, but loud enough to carry. A single father, she said, with the particular intonation of someone delivering a punchline they've been polishing in their head. In a coffee shop, ordering the cheapest thing on the menu, she let the pause do the work. I wonder if the child support is keeping up with inflation. The men at her table laughed. Not all of them. And not all the way. Two of them offered the kind of thin smiles that men offer when they don't want to be the one who didn't laugh. But the sound was enough. Vivienne, feeling the warmth of an audience, leaned back with the practiced ease of someone who has learned that cruelty lands better when it looks effortless. You know what they call a man whose wife left him with the kids, and he's still buying $3.50 coffee? She paused again, glancing around at the nearby tables, making sure her radius had expanded, making sure there were more witnesses. They call him Tuesday. A few people nearby looked away. A woman 2 tables over pressed her lips together and found something suddenly very interesting in her phone screen. Priya, behind the counter, straightened slightly and reached for a cloth she didn't need to wipe down. Marcus Hale did not look up. He took another sip of his coffee, set the cup down carefully, and returned his gaze to the door. Vivienne interpreted his silence as confirmation. This was a pattern she had learned long ago, that people who don't fight back are people who can't. She slid her phone from the table and, with the casual entitlement of someone who has never once considered that a stranger might have a private life worth protecting, took a photograph. Marcus, sitting at his corner table, coffee cup in hand, backpack at his feet, captured without his knowledge or consent, framed by the velvet chair and the mahogany paneling and everything he didn't fit inside. She typed something above it, something with the phrase participation trophy for showing up to life, and added a second line about deadbeat energy and the specific kind of resignation she claimed to see in his posture, and tapped the post live before any of the men at her table had finished their second reaction. There, she said, and smiled at her phone like she had accomplished something. One of the men at her table glanced at the screen and laughed, and then looked at Marcus for a second, and then looked back at his coffee in a way that was not quite discomfort and not quite guilt, but was several degrees closer to both than he was comfortable examining. The murmur of the café continued. Business deals and espresso steam and the low perpetual soundtrack of people performing success for one another. Marcus turned his paper cup slowly in his hands, once counterclockwise, and then set it back down. He did not look at his phone. He did not look at Vivienne. He looked at the door, and he looked at the window, and he looked at the 3 stools at the corner of the counter where there was a slight gap in the sight line, and he settled back into the particular quality of stillness that was not patience. He was not waiting for anything to be over, but presence, the simple, total, unglamorous act of being exactly where he was. The shift in Vivienne's behavior over the next 20 minutes was like watching a tide come in, gradual and inevitable, and impossible to stop once it had momentum. What had begun as a joke at a stranger's expense, a momentary performance for her colleagues' amusement, had evolved into something more deliberate. She was enjoying herself now in the way that certain people enjoy themselves when they have found something to diminish, and the fact that Marcus Hale had not reacted, had not flushed or defended himself, or gathered his backpack and left in humiliation, seemed to irritate her in a way she was channeling outward rather than inward. His silence was not the silence of a man who hadn't heard. It was the silence of a man who simply did not consider her worth responding to. And that distinction, which she felt somewhere beneath conscious thought, made her sharper. She called over one of the baristas, not Priya, but a younger man named Garrett, who was new and who had not yet developed the professional armor that the rest of the staff wore. "Excuse me," she said, just loud enough. "Would you mind asking that gentleman?" And the word gentleman landed with a particular weight, wrapped in quotation marks. She didn't speak aloud to move to a table closer to the entrance. "The ambiance here matters to our clients, and we have a meeting." Garrett blinked. He looked at Marcus, then back at Vivian, then at the floor. Sir, would you mind?" Marcus looked up at the young man with an expression that was entirely without anger, entirely without anything that could be called wounded, and said quietly, "Of course. No problem." He reached for his backpack. He began to stand. "Actually," said Priya from behind the counter, appearing at Garrett's elbow with the quiet authority of someone who had been waiting for exactly the right moment, "that table is reserved. Sir, you're welcome to stay right where you are. There's a table opening up near the window for your party," she added, addressing Vivienne with a smile so professionally seamless that it was impossible to object to. A beat of silence. Vivienne's jaw tightened. She turned back to her colleagues and picked up her phone and said nothing. But her eyes, once, cut across the room to where Marcus Hale had settled back into his chair. He was watching the entrance again, and not because he was waiting for anyone. The three men came in at 9:44. Marcus registered them at the door, not with his eyes, or not obviously, but with some deeper, more practiced sense that had been trained into him over 2 decades of operating in environments where the difference between noticing and not noticing was frequently the difference between life and something else. They wore baseball caps pulled low and surgical masks, which was not by itself unusual. Plenty of people still wore masks in public spaces, but it was the combination of small things that assembled themselves in Marcus's mind, with the cold efficiency of a threat assessment. The shoes first. Low-profile tactical boots with composite toe construction, the kind that looked civilian but were built for weight, bearing and quick movement. The way the tallest one scanned the room upon entering, not the casual glance of a customer looking for a table, but the systematic sweep of a man cataloging exits. The way the second one positioned himself 3 feet inside the door and stopped, which was not where you stopped if you were looking for a seat. And the hands, the way all 3 of them kept their dominant hands close to their bodies, close to the waistband of their jackets, in the specific posture of men who were aware of what they were carrying. Marcus did not move. He did not change his expression. He set his coffee cup down on the table, with the precise, unhurried care of a man placing an object he intended to pick up again. And he breathed out, slowly, through his nose. He let his hands fall open in his lap. Around him, the café continued. Vivienne was explaining something to her colleagues about brand positioning. The espresso machine hissed. Someone's phone played a few bars of a notification chime. The world was exactly as it had been 30 seconds ago, and Marcus Hale was the only person in it who knew that it was about to change. "Would you look at that?" Vivienne said, apparently having noticed the direction of his gaze. "He's people-watching now. Is that what single dads do? Count the customers?" She delivered it with a performer's timing, milking a laugh from the 2 colleagues who were still paying attention. "What do you think, gentlemen? Does he think he's some kind of secret agent?" The laugh this time was a little thinner, a little more obligatory. One of the men at her table glanced over at Marcus with an expression that was not quite a smile anymore, and then glanced at the 3 men near the entrance, and looked back at Vivienne. He opened his mouth to say something. He didn't get the chance. The tallest one moved first. The gun came from beneath his jacket in a motion so practiced it had no wasted element. One hand on the grip, one pulling back the action, the voice that came with it hard and percussive and designed to cut through ambient noise and land in the lizard brain. "Nobody move. Hands where I can see them. Now." The second one turned and flipped the latch on the front door, the deadbolt seating itself with a sound that seemed, in retrospect, impossibly loud. The third went directly to the counter, vaulting it with practiced ease. pulling the manager by the collar and pressing a second weapon into the back of his neck. Register. All of it. Move. The cafe became a different place. The sound of it changed. First conversation evaporated, replaced by the sharp inhale of collective terror, then the shuffling and crying of people who were lowering themselves to the floor, because the instinct to make themselves small is one of the oldest human instincts there is. Vivian Carr's transformation was instantaneous and total. 3 seconds ago, she had been leaning back in her velvet chair with the easy authority of a woman who had never once doubted her own importance. And now she was standing with her hands raised and her mouth open, and the sound coming out of her was not words. It was just sound, high and involuntary, the sound a person makes when the scaffolding of their sense of safety collapses all at once. The tallest gunman crossed to her table in 4 strides, and pressed the barrel against her temple, and said something that nobody heard clearly over the noise of the room, and whatever was left of her composure dissolved entirely. Her knees buckled. He grabbed her arm to keep her upright, and she sobbed with an abandon that had no dignity left in it at all, just pure, stripped-down fear. The kind that equalizes everyone. Around the room, people dropped to their knees. Priya, behind the counter, pressed herself against the back wall with her hands up. Garrett sat on the floor, next to the espresso machine. 3 customers near the window were face down with their phones abandoned beside them. The room was a tableau of surrender, everyone on the floor, everyone reduced, everyone looking at their own hands, or the polished wood of the flooring, and silently bargaining with whatever they believed in. Everyone except Marcus Hale. He was still in his chair. Not frozen, there was nothing rigid about him, but seated in the same composed, back-against-the-wall position he had occupied for the past half hour, his hands resting open on the table in front of him, his coffee cup exactly where he had placed it. He was watching the 3 men with the same quiet, complete attention he had been watching the room with all morning. And there was something about the quality of that attention, its total absence of panic, its clinical, measuring steadiness that made the tallest gunman notice him before anyone else. The tallest gunman turned from Vivian, swinging the weapon toward the corner. "Hey, old man!" His voice had the hoarse edge of adrenaline, the slight pitch of a man who was running on a plan and needed every variable to behave. "On the floor. Now. Get down." He took 2 steps toward the corner table. Marcus looked at him. Not at the gun, at him. At his eyes. At his center mass. At his feet. At the distance between them. At the angle of the second man who was still near the door. At the precise position of the 3rd man behind the counter. And then, Marcus Hale stood up. What happened in the next 2 seconds was something that the human eye, untrained, was genuinely not equipped to process in real time. The barista Priya would later tell investigators that she had seen the tall man take a step, and then she had seen him on the floor, and she could not account for the interval between those 2 images. A customer near the window said it looked like a camera cut 1 frame, then a completely different frame, with no transition. Vivian Carr, who was the closest civilian and who had a clear line of sight, said in her statement that she had closed her eyes when the gunman turned toward Marcus, and that by the time she opened them, all 3 men were down. She had heard sounds, 2 impacts, a crack, something that might have been a surprised exhalation, but she had not seen anything she could describe. What happened, assembled later from the security footage that the investigators reviewed frame by frame and still argued about in the break room. Marcus moved from standing to contact in approximately 4/10 of a second. The first strike, a palm heel to the chin of the tall man, rotated him off axis and sent the weapon wide. The weapon was taken in the same motion, Marcus's right hand redirecting the gun arm while his left came across and down in a controlled joint lock that produced the sound Vivienne had described as a crack, which was the sound of a radius bone accepting more torque than it was designed for. The second man near the door was reaching for his own weapon when Marcus, still in motion, covered the distance between them in what the footage counted as 6 frames less than a quarter second, and what happened next was a sequence of contact points so precise and so economical that the investigators circled the footage notation and wrote in the margin, "Military." The second man went down without a sound. The third man behind the counter had turned at the noise and leveled his weapon, and found, in the time it took him to complete that motion, that his weapon was no longer in his hand, and that something was pressing against the back of his neck that was not a gun barrel, but was more convincing than one. He dropped. He did not get up. 2 seconds. 2 full seconds from the moment Marcus rose from his chair to the moment all 3 men were on the floor, disarmed, the collected weapons arranged on the counter with their safeties engaged, placed there by hands that had done this, or something very much like this enough times, that the motion of it was simply muscle memory now, deep and automatic, and utterly without flair. Marcus walked back to his table. He picked up his coffee cup. He took a sip. The cup had not fully cooled. For approximately 4 seconds, the cafe was entirely silent. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a room full of people who have just witnessed something that their brains have not yet found a category for. Then Priya, from behind the counter, made a sound that was somewhere between a breath and a word, and the room exhaled all at once, and someone started crying, and someone else started talking very fast, and Garrett, still sitting on the floor, looked at Marcus Hale with an expression that an artist would have spent weeks trying to capture. The first police cruiser arrived in under 4 minutes. 2 officers came through the unlocked side entrance. Someone had opened the deadbolt, with hands on their weapons, moving in the deliberate crouch of officers entering an unknown situation. The first officer through the door was a patrol sergeant named Dwight Calloway, 15-year veteran, and he swept the room with practiced efficiency and cataloged the 3 zip-tied figures on the floor, and the row of disarmed weapons on the counter, and the room full of shaken civilians, and then his eyes found Marcus Hale sitting at his corner table with a paper coffee cup, and Sergeant Calloway did something that nobody in the cafe had ever seen a uniformed officer do upon entering an active crime scene. He stopped walking. He came to attention. Not parade ground, not theatrical, just the quiet, involuntary straightening of a man whose training had overridden his assessment of the situation, whose body had recognized something before his conscious mind had caught up with it. "Sir," he said. Just that. One word. The word fell into the room like a stone into still water, and the ripples of it reached every corner. Vivienne Carr, sitting on the floor against the far wall with mascara on her cheeks and her white blazer wrinkled past recognition, looked at the sergeant, and then at Marcus, and then back at the sergeant. One of the men from her table said, quietly, "What in the federal agent arrived 12 minutes later, introduced herself as Special Agent Dana Reyes, and spoke with Marcus privately for several minutes in the hallway by the restrooms. She did most of the listening. When they came back into the main room, she addressed the assembled witnesses, the officers, the customers, the staff with the crisp economy of someone delivering a briefing. She did not ask anyone's permission to share what she was sharing, and she did not appear to consider that the man beside her might have preferred a different kind of mourning. She said that Marcus Hale had served for 22 years in the United States Army, the last 14 of those in the unit designated 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta, and that his operational record included deployments across 4 continents, involvement in counter-terrorism operations that remained classified, and a number of hostage rescue missions that she was not at liberty to detail, but that she could confirm had all ended with the hostages alive. She said that he held decorations she was not going to list. She said that he had retired quietly, without fanfare, without a press release several years ago, and that he was, as far as she knew, the most dangerous person in any given room he walked into, and that he had never once in his career felt the need to announce it. Marcus, during this, stood with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the floor. And when Dana was finished, he looked up and said, to nobody in particular, "My coffee got cold." Priya laughed a startled, helpless, genuine laugh and said she would make him a fresh one. On the house. Nobody in the cafe that morning knew, and Agent Reyes did not say, the part of Marcus Hale's story that mattered more than all the classified missions and all the decorations she had declined to list. They did not know about Catherine. They did not know that he had met her during a brief stateside rotation 18 years ago, at a bookstore where they had reached for the same paperback at the same moment, and she had not apologized for taking it, and he had found that impossibly appealing, that she had laughed at something he said on their 3rd date in a way that he had decided was the best sound he had ever heard in his life, that they had gotten married in a courthouse in September with his sister and her parents as witnesses, because they had both agreed that small and real was better than large and performed. Catherine had been the kind of woman who kept lists of things she wanted to understand, actual handwritten lists in notebooks she carried everywhere, covering topics that ranged from cloud formation to the history of trade routes, to why certain chords produced sadness in minor keys. She had been finishing a degree in environmental science when they met, and she had finished it 2 years into their marriage. And she had worked for a non-profit that monitored watershed health in 3 states, and she had been, by every account Marcus trusted, very good at it. They had been, by every measure Marcus had, happy. They did not know that his son, Nathan, had been born 2 years into the marriage, or that Catherine had been diagnosed with a particularly aggressive form of ovarian cancer when Nathan was 4 years old, or that Marcus had taken every available leave and compassionate assignment and had sat with her through every treatment and had held her hand on the night that the holding became the last thing he could do. He had been 38 years old. Nathan had been 5, old enough to feel the shape of the loss without having the language for it, old enough that the absence would be something he grew up around rather than something he could remember beginning. Marcus had kissed Catherine's forehead and stayed in the room until the nurses had given him a reason to leave, and then he had gone out into the hospital corridor and sat on a plastic chair with his forearms on his knees and his hands folded, and he had sat there for a very long time in the specific way of a man who has survived things and knows how to go still, when stillness is the only available action. He had gone back to his unit. There were things that needed doing, and he had needed, in those months, something to be very competent at, because, in the domain of his private life, he had felt competent at nothing. He had arranged for his sister to care for Nathan during deployments, and he had come home between assignments and cooked dinner and attended school plays and helped with math homework and gone to soccer practices where he sat on the folding chairs with the other parents and drank terrible coffee from thermos and cheered with a fullness of heart that would have surprised anyone who had known him only in the field. Nathan was 12 when Marcus retired. He was 17 now, a junior in high school with his mother's eyes and his father's habit of listening before speaking. And he was, Marcus thought, the best evidence of anything good he had ever been part of. He had turned down 3 separate positions when he left the service: a consulting role with a defense contractor, a training advisory post at Fort Bragg, a private security contract in the Gulf that would have paid more than he would spend in 5 years. He had turned them down because Nathan was in 9th grade and lived in a house and went to a school and had friends and a soccer team. And Marcus was not going to move him. And Marcus was not going to be away from him again. He had moved back to the city, found an apartment 12 minutes from Nathan's school, found work that was enough to cover what they needed, and had set about the business of being present in a way that he had not always been able to be. He wore the old jacket. He carried the old backpack. He bought the cheapest coffee on the menu, not because he had to, but because it was $3.50, and he had stopped needing the coffee to mean anything a long time ago. The video, when it spread, and it spread with the particular ferocity of content that combines violence and justice and human drama, in proportions that the algorithm and human nature agree on, was not primarily about the 2 seconds. The 2 seconds were there, in every cut and compilation and resharing. Blurry, truncated, the security footage overlaid with music, and slowed down and analyzed in frame-by-frame breakdowns by accounts dedicated to combat sports and military history. But what the video was actually about, what drove the comments and the shares and the emotional reactions that people were tapping on their phones in offices and on public transit and in their own kitchens, was what came before the 2 seconds, because the cafe had cameras, and those cameras had been running all morning. And the footage that circulated was not just the takedown clip, it was the full context. Vivian's voice carrying across the room, the photograph she had taken without asking, the words she had used, the instruction she had given Garrett, the way Marcus had simply sat through all of it with his hands around his coffee cup and looked at the door. Vivian Carr, by the time she drove home from the police station that afternoon, had over 14,000 notifications on her phone. By the evening, it was more than she could look at. By the following morning, the firm had called an emergency internal review, and 3 of her colleagues had sent emails to HR that they had been drafting. It became clear, for quite some time, By the afternoon of the second day, she had been placed on administrative leave pending the outcome of the review. Her professional networking profile had been found and visited and commented on in ways that were thorough and largely unflattering. A journalist from a business publication had reached out for comment. Two of the men from her table had given interviews to local news in which they used the phrase, "I was uncomfortable, but I didn't say anything," which was true enough to be useless as a defense. She sat in her apartment on the second evening and looked at her phone screen for a long time, and then set it face down on the coffee table and did not pick it up. The apartment was expensive and well-appointed and decorated with the particular impersonality of someone who had furnished a space to impress visitors rather than to live in. In a way she was not examining directly. Very large and very quiet. She thought about the way she had felt when the gun had been pressed against her temple, the specific quality of that fear. The way it had removed, in an instant, every layer of everything she had constructed between herself and the raw fact of her own vulnerability. There was no blazer in the world that helped with that. There was no title and no watch and no audience. There was only her, on the floor, shaking, and the understanding, arriving with the clarity of something that had always been true but had simply never been demonstrated. That her sense of superiority over others had been exactly as solid as paper, and that it had taken approximately 45 seconds and the presence of 3 armed men to dissolve it completely. She thought about the photograph she had posted, and the words above it, and the way Marcus had looked at Garrett when Garrett had come to ask him to move without resentment, without shame, with nothing more than the slight adjusting of a man who had long since decided that other people's estimation of him was not something he was obligated to carry. She did not sleep well. She did not sleep at all. Really, she lay in the dark and watched the ceiling and thought about things she had been not thinking about for a long time, which turned out to be quite a number of things once she started. She called her assistant the next morning and said she needed the address of Marcus Hale. The assistant, who had been following the story with the rest of the world, was quiet for a moment, and then said she would find what she could. It took her 4 days to find him. He was not, as it turned out, difficult to locate. He was simply a man who did not maintain a large footprint, who was not on many lists, whose name appeared in municipal records and school directories, and not much else. She drove to the address on a Saturday morning and sat in her car outside the building for 11 minutes before she got out. She was wearing jeans and a plain gray sweater. No rings. The watch was at home. She had not been certain, getting dressed, what the right version of herself was for this errand, and she had landed on the plainest available interpretation. She went to the second floor and stood in front of apartment 214 and knocked. He answered quickly, which suggested he had heard her on the stairs, or, she thought, perhaps he had seen her through the peephole for the full 11 minutes she had spent working up to the knock. He was wearing the same field jacket. He looked at her without surprise, without any particular expression at all, and waited. "My name is Vivienne Carr," she said, which was unnecessary. He knew exactly who she was, but she said it because she felt that she needed to begin somewhere, and that somewhere was her name, her actual name, without a title in front of it. "I came to apologize. I don't have a script for this. I practiced something in the car, and it sounded like a PR statement, so I threw it out." She looked at him. He was still waiting. "Everything I said to you was wrong. All of it. I judged you because you were wearing an old jacket and buying cheap coffee, and I thought that meant I understood something about your life, and I was so certain I was right that I said it out loud to make other people laugh, and that was..." She stopped. "That was the cruelest thing I've done in a long time," she said, "and I've done some things I'm not proud of. And the worst part is that I wouldn't have known how wrong I was if something terrible hadn't happened, and I don't think that says anything good about me." Marcus Hale looked at her for a moment. Then he stepped back from the doorway and said, "You want coffee?" She blinked. Yes, thank you." The apartment was small and clean and organized in the particular way of a man who had spent years living out of kit bags and who had learned to know where everything was at all times. There were photographs on the wall beside the window, a boy at various ages, a soccer field, a school play. One photo of a woman with dark hair laughing at something off camera, the most candid and human thing in the room. Marcus made coffee from a countertop drip machine, the supermarket brand, and handed her a mug and sat across from her at the small kitchen table. "You don't have to explain," he said. "I want to," she said. "I need to, I think." "All right." She did. She talked for a while, and he listened in the way that she had noticed in the cafe, not passively, not simply waiting for his turn, but with a complete and serious attention that was more uncomfortable, she found, than indifference would have been. When she was finished, there was a short silence. He turned his coffee mug once in his hands, and she recognized the gesture from the security footage, that same slow, deliberate rotation. "You don't need me to forgive you," he said. "That's not what this is actually about." "What is it about?" He considered this. "You already know what you did and why. You don't need me to confirm it." He looked at her steadily. "What you actually came here for is to find out if there's a version of you that's better than the one that was in that cafe. And I can't tell you that. Only you can do that, over time, in choices that nobody's watching." He paused. "Don't judge people because you think you know their story. You almost never know their story. I've learned that in places I can't talk about, and I've learned it in grocery stores and on soccer sidelines and in this kitchen. It applies everywhere." Vivienne Carr drove home with her hands steady on the wheel, and the gray sweater, and no rings, and she sat in the parking garage for a long time. What followed, in the months after, was quieter than the week that had preceded it. The internal review at Vivienne's firm concluded, and she was not fired. There were mitigating factors noted in the summary, though none of the people who had commented on her professional profile found those factors particularly mitigating, and the climate within the firm had shifted in a way that could not be entirely attributed to the review's outcome. She requested a transfer to a different role, one with less client-facing responsibility and more internal work. And the request was granted. She began, on weekends, to volunteer at a family resource center 2 miles from her apartment, a place that served, among others, single parents navigating the bureaucratic landscape of childcare subsidies and housing applications and employment retraining. She was not, at first, very good at it. She was too efficient, too solutions-oriented, too quick to assume that she understood the shape of a problem from the outside, too prone to interrupting a story before it had reached the part that mattered. She had spent 12 years in professional environments where speed and decisiveness were rewarded, where the person who arrived with the answer was the person who won the room, and she had to unlearn a significant amount of that in order to be useful in a room where answers were rarely the point. The director of the center, a woman named Marguerite, who had been doing this work for 17 years, and who had the particular tirelessness of someone powered by something other than ambition, told her once, without unkindness, "The people who come in here don't need you to fix them. They need you to believe that they can fix themselves, and to stand next to them while they do it." Vivienne thought about that for a long time. She thought about it on the drive home, and while she was making dinner, and in the morning before she got out of bed. She thought about Marcus Hale sitting at his corner table while the room laughed at him, utterly unhurried, unconcerned with what they thought, simply present in himself in a way that required nothing from anyone else. She thought about what it might mean to be that solid. She thought, for the first time in a long time, about what she actually wanted to be made of. She got better. Slowly, in the way that real things get better. Not in a straight line, not without setbacks. Not accompanied by any particular announcement. She learned the names of the families. She learned to sit across a table from someone who was having a very hard time, and not immediately reach for the solution. But first, to simply be present, to make the space safe enough that the person could say what they actually needed to say. She thought, occasionally, about what Marcus had said to her in his kitchen. Only you can do that, over time, in choices that nobody's watching. She had turned those words over enough times that they had stopped feeling like a rebuke and started feeling like a direction. Marcus Hale returned to Hartwell and Sons Coffee House on a Thursday morning, about 3 months after what the staff had started calling quietly, among themselves, not for public consumption the morning. He came in at 9:17, which was when he always came in. He was wearing the field jacket. He was carrying the black nylon backpack. He ordered a regular drip coffee, smallest size, and paid in exact change. Priya was behind the counter, and when she looked up and saw him, she smiled in a way that was not her professional smile. It was something older and more personal, the smile of a person seeing someone they are genuinely glad to exist in the world, the smile of someone who has been in a room when something real happened and is carrying the memory of it carefully. "Same table?" she said. "Same table," he said. He sat down and wrapped his hands around the paper cup and looked at the room. The room was mostly the same mahogany, brass fixtures, conversations about mergers and quarterly projections, the perpetual performance of people who needed other people to see them succeeding. A new painting had gone up on the far wall, something abstract and expensive-looking that nobody seemed to actually look at. The corner table, his table, had a small scratch on its surface near the edge that had not been there before, and he noticed this the way he noticed everything, without assigning it significance, simply filing it. But Priya had given Garrett a small nod from behind the counter. And Garrett, who was no longer new, who had grown into the quiet authority of a young man who has witnessed something real and been changed by it, straightened and looked over at Marcus's table, and the two of them exchanged the slight, mutual acknowledgement of people who share a specific morning in their histories. A few other regulars were in that day people who had been there 3 months ago, who recognized him. Nobody made a production of it. A man in his 50s at the counter caught Marcus's eye and gave him a small nod, the kind that carries more weight than a handshake. A woman reading at the window table lifted her coffee cup slightly, as if in a toast, and then looked back at her book. The acknowledgement moved through the room, not like applause but like a tide, quiet, present, unmistakable. It was the acknowledgement that matters most. Not the kind that announces itself, but the kind that simply knows. Marcus drank his coffee. He looked at the door. He checked the windows, the corners, the positions of the people around him, not because he was expecting anything, but because it was the thing he was, and he had long since made his peace with that. He thought about Nathan, who was at school right now in the 3rd period of his Tuesday morning, probably half listening in history class and doodling in his notebook the way he had always done since he was small, drawing the elaborate, interconnected shapes that Marcus had never been able to identify, but that Nathan always said were maps of places he was going to visit. Marcus would be at the soccer field at 4. He would be 10 minutes early, as he always was, and he would sit on the folding chairs and drink whatever was in his thermos and watch his son run, and he would feel, as he always did in those moments, that he had navigated his way to somewhere worth being. Not easily, not without cost, but worth being, nonetheless. He finished his coffee. He stood and put on his backpack and nodded once to Priya, who nodded back. He walked to the door. He pushed it open and stepped out into the morning air, which was cool and clean and full of the particular noise of a city going about its business. And Marcus Hale walked through it unremarkably, the same as any other Tuesday, carrying nothing that anyone could see. The real measure of a person is not found in the moments when the room is watching, and the stakes are obvious, and the choice is clear. It is found in the long, unobserved stretches of ordinary days, in whether you show up, whether you stay, whether you keep choosing the harder and quieter and less visible version of the right thing. Marcus Hale had served for 22 years in some of the most dangerous places on earth, and he had done things that took a specific and extraordinary kind of courage. But the courage that had carried him through the last 12 years, the courage of getting up every morning and making breakfast and driving to school and sitting on folding chairs at soccer practices and being present in all the unremarkable ways that presence requires, that was the courage that mattered most to him. Not because it was harder, though some days it was, but because it was his son's, because it was what Nathan would remember. Because strength, real strength, is not measured in the seconds you spend dismantling a threat. It is measured in the thousands of ordinary moments you show up for afterward, in the same old jacket, with the same quiet attention, with nothing to prove to anyone at all.